Hello, everyone, and welcome to When the Taboo of Death Makes You Lose Your Senses. I am Danielle Vasone. I'm a licensed clinical social worker at Tidewell Hospice in Florida, in Sarasota and Bradenton area, and I lead up our Blue Butterfly Family Grief Center. This is a center that supports children who are grieving the death of someone that they love. So I have some insight to share with you today about death, how to talk to children about death, and hopefully you get a lot out of it today. So thank you so much for joining my session. So let's just go over the learning objectives for today. I really want for you to understand the developmentally appropriate terms to use with children when you're talking to them about death and different types of death. I also want you to feel confident in your language and nonverbal cues so that you can provide education and support to children during this time. Also, it's super important for us to break the societal taboo of speaking to children about traumatic types of death with anything less than the truth. All right, so let's get going. I think it's most important to first start by talking about children, grief, death. Why is this happening? Why are there so many grieving children? So Judy's House is a grief center in Denver, Colorado. They created the Children's Bereavement Estimation Model. And you can actually visit their website if you are looking for statistics for other states, but I've put Florida's here for us. And as you can see, Florida has 1 in 13 children in the state of Florida will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the time they turn 18. That actually puts Florida 22nd in the ranking of the 50 states for children who are grieving. So 317,000 children will be affected by the time they turn 18, and then that doubles to 786,000 by the time they turn 25. So I put this up here because I think it's really relevant in understanding that this type of education on prepping ourselves to be able to speak about death, to be able to talk to children about death, it's so prevalent, it's so important, as evident by these numbers here. So let's talk about death. So what is hard for you when talking to children about death? I put some things up here, but some things that came to mind for me when I'm working with other clinicians in the field is that they often tell me that they don't feel prepared. They don't feel like they have all the facts, or they are not well versed in using the right language, haven't done this a bunch of times. Especially child life specialists, you're working in the hospital, sometimes you're working with children who are ill, but not necessarily dying, or you're not necessarily always prepping kids and families for that death conversation. So I can understand why it would be a little nerve-wracking and scary. So we're going to talk about that today. We want to talk about how you can be prepared, right? Well, we know practice makes perfect. So going over things more than once, studying, looking up research, looking up best practices, all things that are very helpful for us to feel more prepared to be able to support grieving kids. Who should be involved when we're talking about death to children, right? The caregiver should be involved. Whoever is that adult taking care of that child. Extended family might be involved, siblings. We also want the social worker. If you're at a hospital or a hospice, there should be social workers involved who can help us as well. And of course, the child life specialist. And what tools are available to help us? Well, I know medical play tools are really helpful. Bibliotherapy, books. I have a huge library of children's books here that I loan out to families so that they can have another resource and another way to describe death and dying to children who have trouble grasping it. You can use art, music, games, paper, and crayons. All really good resources to use when working with children when you're talking about death or dying or grief. All right, so what do we know about kids? So much, right? And here's just a few things. So we know children are concrete thinkers. We know without a doubt children need to hear words like dying, dead, died. This is such a strong one, and we're going to talk more about it later. But I just want to stress how important that is. I was actually at an event, tabling for our bereavement center, and we were trying to interact with the community, and we were trying to collect cards, have people from the community come to our table and make a card for a grieving child. Well, one of the ladies next to me was speaking to a visitor to our table, a young child, and said to that child, "Do you want to create a card for a child who lost their parents?" So the child creates the card and turns it in. And I look at the card and it says, "I'm sorry you've lost your parents. I hope you find them soon." And that example sticks with me so much because it just constantly reminds me that children are concrete thinkers. That child literally thought that the parents were lost, like we were playing hide and seek. And we know that the parents had died, but because we didn't use the right language, we used lost instead of died, that child didn't know. So just an example for you. So of course, children want to know the truth, and they need age-appropriate language. We're going to talk a lot about that today, about the best language to use when you are going to communicate death and dying to children. Children will use play to act out their feelings or emotions. That is how many of us interact with kids in the first place. We use play tools and play techniques because that's how kids communicate. Play is their language, and you guys know that so well. But sometimes we forget that play can even be a helpful resource for us when we're working with kids during trauma or when we're telling them bad news as well. Developmental stages play a role in the child's understanding, and it also is going to play a role in our approach when we're going to work with the child and share news with them or prep them for some bad news. Children are curious and creative. We know that. We know children are curious and creative, and then that affects our approach as well. We need to be prepared for them to ask us questions, right? Children may have lots of questions or may have none at all, but it's helpful for us to be prepared for both. Death can be confusing to understand for children. We know that. Death is abstract sometimes. Where do people go when they die? All of these things can be confusing for kids. And it's up to us to be prepared to be able to help them process this. Okay, so let's talk about some terms and language that are really important for us to feel confident in sharing and talking about to parents as well as kiddos, because if we're not confident, then they're not going to be confident. I spend a lot of time coaching and sharing helpful tips with caregivers and parents and family members so that they're talking to their child correctly, so that they're sharing the proper language and mirroring the proper behaviors when they're with their kids at home. So for us, first and foremost, we have to be using this language. So right up there, right up front, dying, dead, and died. So let's just talk about that. I think people are so nervous to use these words that they flower it up. You know, that's why we hear people use words like passed away or lost. Or if you're in the hospice field or a hospital, you might even hear words like expired. And we know that these words are not helpful and they do not convey the correct message to children. So we must use words like dying, dead, and died. And why? Because they are developmentally appropriate for kids. They are. We teach kids from a super young age, be gentle to the baby. Be gentle to the lizard. You don't want to squeeze the lizard, it might die. Don't step on the bug. Be gentle to the plant. We don't want to kill the plant. We teach them this language all the time from a very young age. And the same applies to people. They've already been hearing this language, so they have it in their brain. We just have to bring it back out when we're talking to them about people who have died and even harder topics than animals and plants. Using this language helps kids to understand the permanence and the finality of the death. When you flower it up, kids might get confused and might really think, oh, well, maybe this person's not really dead. Maybe they're coming back. But when we use concrete language that help them to understand, no, they died. They're not coming back. That really helps kids to understand what we mean. And then, of course, then their grief process can begin. So let's talk about cancer. I think this is another tough one. I have some families that I work with that I get them after the person has died, and they haven't been honest with their child about that their loved one, their person had died from cancer. And they think it's a scary word or that the word is too hard to understand for kids. And that's just simply not true. Kids can understand what cancer is, and it doesn't have to be scary to talk about. I always recommend when you're explaining an illness like cancer to kids that you use a scientific approach. So I might say, cancer is an illness that affects our organs and shuts them down. When our organs shut down, our body doesn't work right and we die. Very simple, very straightforward to the point. And it's not scary, right? We're talking about organs. Now, if you've never mentioned the word organs before, right, you might have to then explain, well, what are organs? Well, organs are like our heart, they're like our lungs that help us breathe. Our brain is an organ, and cancer can affect any of those organs. And when cancer affects an organ, it shuts it down. And then when our organs shut down, we can't live anymore and we die. I really practice this language. I have said this sentence so many times in trainings and educational moments just to help myself feel more confident in saying it, and of course to share this information with others. So for you, if you need to practice, get used to saying that sentence so that you feel confident when you're presenting it to a child or to a caregiver who's going to present it to their child. Make it your own. Definitely feel free to change up some of the verbiage, but stick to the facts. You're talking about organs that were attacked. They are shutting down and therefore we're dying. We want to stay away from cancer made us really, really sick. Using the word sick, kids know that word. They get the flu. We have coronavirus right now. They understand sick. And if you talk about cancer and sick, that can make kids really scared. It can make them scared because they might think, oh no, the next time I get sick, I'm going to have cancer and die. And that's just not true. We don't want to put those thoughts into kids' heads. So we stay away from sick. It also can lead them to think, oh no, the next time mommy's sick or grandma or grandpa's sick, they're going to die. And that's not true. So we want to try to stay away from that and stick to the organs are shutting down. Okay, so let's talk about murder. Murder is definitely a hard one to talk about, right? And I assume this type of opportunity to share this information might come from the emergency room. You might be in the emergency room sharing this information with family members, or we might have it in the grief center that we work with after the fact, right? When the child is still trying to process what happened to their person. So we recommend that you don't share the gory details, right? You don't need to share the method in which how they died. And similarly, this will go for suicide as well when we talk about that. But again, we want to try the scientific approach. So murder is when someone kills another person and they die. Very straightforward, right? Very short and to the point. Some kids require more information than that, and that's okay. So you might need to share with them that another person shot dad with a gun and he died. You might have to say that. And that would be appropriate. We always recommend being as honest and open as you can, but age appropriate. You might not share that same language that you would with a teen with a little. So you have to be aware, of course, of your audience and prep for that. If you're also trying to explain an injury, right? So if someone did get shot, you could take the scientific approach and you could say one of the organs in dad's body was shot with a bullet and that organ is bleeding and it's no longer able to function. And when organs can't function, they shut down and they die. Always try to go to that scientific approach. To me, it's my safe place. I'm able to think logically about it, and share it logically, and then it really helps kids to understand it the best way. All right, so suicide is another tough one. I tread very carefully with suicide because I always want to follow the caregiver's lead. Some caregivers don't want their child to know that word, suicide. They also don't want them to know what that means exactly. And it definitely depends on the developmental age of the child. So I have a young boy in my group. When he started with us, he was about 6 or 7. He's about 8 or 9 now. And his dad took his own life. And so when he was in group, you would ask him, "How did your daddy die?" And he would tell us that his brain was sick. And I was always very glad that his mom explained it to him in that way, because to me, that is a very developmentally appropriate way to explain to a 5, 6, 7-year-old how someone died by suicide. And you and I both know that when your brain is sick, or you have mental illness, that very much can lead to suicide. And so for a little, that's a very developmentally appropriate way to explain suicide. Now, for teens or for middle schoolers, that might not be enough, right? Especially because they were probably present for some of the behaviors that were visible that maybe led to this person's death. So we want to take the caregiver's lead, understand what they want that child to know or what they feel comfortable with sharing. And oftentimes I will leave out the method in which how they died. That doesn't really need to be included unless you're working with a teen who's very inquisitive and who, again, knows what happened. I have a teen who his father actually attempted suicide, lived, and this teen went to counseling for it to kind of process, like, why was my dad trying to take his life? And then a few months later, the dad died. And it ended up, we believe, a drug overdose. Not sure if it was accidental or on purpose, right? But that child already knew what was going on. So for him, he needed to know, yes, there were drugs involved. He was not shied away from knowing his dad's behaviors, right? Because it was developmentally appropriate for him. But if we're sharing that type of information with a little, it can often do more harm. We don't want to traumatize the little. And we want to be careful with using words that have to do with drugs or pills or medicine. If you're sharing with a kid, this person took a lot of pills or a lot of medicine and died, that can be really confusing for kids. They're going to think the next time they take medicine for a cold that they might die. So we don't want to put those thoughts in their head, right? We want to use different words. Maybe we use words like pills if we don't normally call their medicine pills. Or we might use words like tablets instead of medicine. Whatever word you use to communicate medicine to your child when they're sick, don't use that word when you're communicating about a drug overdose or taking pills and dying. So as you can see here, I wrote for you, suicide is when someone takes their own life or causes their own death. And you might get follow-up questions about this. I sometimes do and sometimes don't. When we're in a group setting and I share that definition, if you will, when we're doing an activity, I often get a very matter-of-fact answer like, oh, okay. Sometimes I get follow-up questions like, oh, is that like my dad who took a lot of pills and died? You know, and I often let the child tell me how they would classify that. Well, do you feel like that's them taking their own life? And all of that kind of processing and brain power is really helping the child to process and heal. It's helping them to make sense of what do they know, what are they learning, and what is the story about their person's death? What is their grief story? Natural causes, okay? So natural causes are ones that come up a lot at hospice where I work, because we often see a lot of older people dying. They're at the end of their life. They are in their 80s or 90s, and they are at the end of life. They are either dying peacefully, or they might sometimes have cancer, and then we take the cancer approach, but sometimes they're just dying of old age, right? We often don't use language like, well, they were very old and died, right? And we don't want to use that language because that can be confusing for kids. Think of a 5-year-old, right? They're going to think their mom's really old. They're going to think I'm really old. But really, we're talking about really old as a 90-year-old or even more, right? So we don't want to scare them with that language because they're going to think, oh no, my mom's really old. Maybe she might die too. So again, we try to take that scientific approach. When someone dies from natural causes, this means their body worked really hard for a long time and their body stopped working and their organs shut down and they died. So again, focusing on those organs. Your body can't work without organs. So from a young age, you can even teach your child about organs and their role within your body. We talk a lot about heart attacks as another one. I often describe it by doing a visual. I'm like, your heart is beating, beat, 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 beat. And when it beats, it pumps blood throughout your entire body. But when your heart can't beat anymore, it can't pump the blood to your body. And if your body can't get blood, like your brain or your arms or your legs, it shuts down your organs. And when your organs shut down, you die. Do you see how we're taking that scientific approach? It doesn't sound scary when you take the scientific approach. When we're talking about a beating heart, beat, 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 and it pumps the blood, that really helps them to understand and to visualize it. And then it's a lot less scary. I threw hospice in here since I work at hospice. I often find that families have a tough time explaining what hospice is to children. And at our hospice houses, we welcome children in to our houses to visit their loved ones. So I just wanted to include this for you. You never know how it might come in handy. So for your knowledge, of course, hospice can be available to patients who are dying. They have a life-threatening illness and they have 6 months or less to live. And we can provide this end-of-life care anywhere the patient calls home. So at their home, at a hospital, we have hospital wings for hospice care now. We can provide it at assisted livings or nursing homes, and of course at our hospice houses. So I put a few sentences here, phrasing you can use when you're describing hospice to kids. Hospice is a service that provides care for your person when they are close to the end of their life. Hospice can help your person's pain go away so he or she is comfortable and calm. At hospice, there will be no wires or IVs coming from your person's body, and they won't be getting any medicine to cure them or to help them get better. Your person's organs are shutting down, and when our organs shut down and stop working, we will die. So hopefully those phrasings can help you to feel a little bit more confident as you're working with children and families and you're prepping them for hospice information. Keep in mind that a lot of this information could be shared with adults, with those caregivers or family members who live with children or who would prefer to voice this information to the child themselves. But if you're not confident giving the information, then the parent won't be confident giving the information. So I'm just trying to provide you with the most examples that I can. Okay, so why do kids even need to know about death? And I tried to approach this presentation from two perspectives, right? Prepping a child to understand that so-and-so is dying or that their person is dying, or letting a child know that their person had already died. So you will see some tips here that can be applied to both scenarios. So why do kids need to know? Why do they need to know the truth? Why do they need to know about the details? Why do they need to know about the death? And the answer is because they deserve to know the truth. And that's because it's their person that died. I often have to share this information with caregivers to help them understand that, because if first and foremost, if we're talking about parents, siblings, grandparents, people who are immediate family members of kids, it's their person, it's their dad, it's their mom. Of course they deserve to know. They need to know. And we're going to explain why shortly, but they have a right to know the truth, okay? And that is so important. When I ask kids in my program all the time and in my individual sessions, I'll ask them, do you remember the day that your mom told you that your dad died? And every time they can give me the exact details of the moment, where they were, who was there, how busy it was, how loud it was, and if their parent did a good job or not. And I promise you, I will ask the caregivers the exact same question and they won't remember a thing. They often say to me, "Oh, it was just such a crazy time. I was in a daze. I had so and so help me tell them, and they reacted fine. They cried just a little bit and then they were playing." But when you go back and ask that child, they remember every single detail. And that's because, think about this now when I say it, this is very likely the worst day of their lives. This is very likely the worst day of their lives, the day that everything came crashing down, their whole world changed, and it's going to stick with them for a long while. And you may or may not have an opportunity to be a part of it. And you may or may not have an opportunity to prep the caregiver to understand the importance of them being prepared to share information with their child. Okay. So, how does sharing this death information affect children? It can affect their grief process and their grief journey. Information about the death has a direct effect on their ability to grieve, process, and heal. And we know this because I've worked with many kids who have been lied to about the way their person died, or hasn't been told the whole story. And later on, years later, they are still upset. They are still resentful to that caregiver for not telling them the truth. They are angry, and those behave. Not only are they voluntarily angry, right, and showing that, they're involuntarily angry. We see anger outbursts that we didn't even know were there, or had no trigger, and here we are just with this angry child. And it's because children can't regulate their emotions that well. So when they are angry inside about how they found out their person died, or perhaps it was they didn't know the severity of an illness that their person had, and they had no idea their person was going to die. They weren't told until shortly, the week of, or maybe the day before. And that didn't give that child enough time to process and prepare themselves for what was to come. And so they're angry now. And now we're seeing a lot of outbursts and a lot of anger coming through that we didn't know was there. So it's really important to be as honest as possible and to include them in as much of the information as you can. So trauma. So children and teens often make up stories in their head about what could have happened to their person when they don't know the truth, or they aren't given the whole story, right? And think about it. Think about how creative kids are when they tell you a story. It is often very magical, right? Or mystical or fictitious. And it's always exacerbated beyond belief. Now apply that to grief. Think about how if the child is imagining a suicide story or a murder story in their head, and you never told them the truth, now they have this crazy story in their head that it was probably worse than what we could have, should have, and would have told them if we were prepared to tell them what actually happened to their person. So it's really important to keep this in mind. We don't want to create trauma for kids because we don't tell them the truth. So it's really important to encourage that to caregivers, that, we recommend that you share the story with the child, but it should be age appropriate and you don't need to share more details than necessary. That's typically how I approach it. Okay, so some tips for talking to children about death. Remember that you'll always have access to this presentation, so you can reference this later, and that's why I put a lot of different phrases in here for you. But we understand using concrete words like dead, died, dying. I talked a lot about that. But let's talk about euphemisms. Oftentimes, when people are talking about someone has died, they often say things like, they're in a better place, or they're an angel now. When I get phone calls from families who want grief support, one of my questions to them is, what does the child know about the death? Oftentimes I get responses from caregivers that say, they know they're an angel in heaven with God. And I'm always kind of like, I didn't hear the word died in there. Did they use the language, daddy died, mommy died? Or did they just simply say, daddy's an angel now? That makes a big difference in the way the child understands, especially if we're talking about a 5-year-old who is trying to understand heaven, angels, all of these things that are kind of far-fetched or kind of hard to imagine, right? We can't touch heaven or touch angels. We don't really get to see them. So it's very hard to understand that. But if we can stay away from that and try to focus on daddy died, then at least we have a good foundation. Now, of course, everyone has different religious beliefs, and they might use their religious beliefs regarding heaven or angels or clouds to help cope, right? I hear that all the time where this child is coping well because they can talk to daddy because they believe that daddy's an angel. That is fine. That is a great way to cope. However, when you're sharing news about a child with a child about a death, it has to be that concrete language at first. You have to start the conversation with daddy died, mommy died, then follow it up with whatever your religious beliefs are. But they have to understand that this is concrete and this person can't come back. We also want to stay away from they're sleeping or they look like they're sleeping, because this happens a lot at funerals, right? Oh, doesn't he just look like he's sleeping? That can be very confusing for kids because they think the next time they go to sleep that they're going to die. And we don't want to scare them out of their routine, out of their typical things that they're used to. That could cause a lot of regression for kids. Typically, if you had children who were sleeping in their own bed or who were sleeping throughout the night and now they're not, that could be because of the way the story was portrayed to them or because of their imagination of understanding about sleep. Oftentimes, if you're seeing kids with sleep issues, they also could be having nightmares and trauma visuals in their mind at nighttime. So we want to be careful of that as well. All right, so we want to be honest, but age appropriate. And we talked about this. Details are not always necessary. I'm not suggesting that you should go into the gory details about how a person hung themselves or shot themselves and what the visual of that room looked like. Children don't need to know that. But it is possible that sometimes you may need to share with children how they died, especially if you have a developmentally advanced child who's trying to understand why daddy was hanging from that rope and what did that rope do to kill him or to hurt him. If you have a child who saw that, you're going to approach the situation very differently. You can't lie to the child and tell them something abstract about how daddy died. Instead, you might have to share a little bit of the truth, right? Age appropriately about the rope. Well, when someone has a rope around their neck and it's really tight, it suffocates them and then they can no longer breathe. And when their lungs can't breathe, their organs shut down and then they die. So although we're talking about a hanging and we're talking about suffocation and we're still talking about the scientific approach of, well, the organs shut down because we couldn't breathe. And that doesn't sound scary. You're not creating a traumatic visual for that child. You're simply explaining it to them in words they can understand so that they don't make up stories in their head. I think that's the biggest key here. You don't want the child to be left with questions unanswered so that they make up stories in their head. I hope that makes sense for you guys. So the third one here is you don't have to have all the answers. I know it kind of feels like I'm giving you all the answers to your problems, but you're definitely going to be asked questions by these kids that you just simply don't know. Why did daddy kill himself? That's a big one. We don't know, right? No one knows. So oftentimes we take the approach at our grief center as just reflecting. Oh, you're wondering why daddy died. Giving them that opportunity to hear the words out loud and to ponder further. And oftentimes the child already has an idea, or the child already knew dad had bad behaviors or overheard someone in the family talking about something, and now they're trying to make sense of it. So oftentimes when I reflect and say, oh, you're wondering why daddy killed himself, the child then repeats to me, yeah, I know daddy had some issues with some big pills, but I don't understand, right? You might get more to the story. And if you think about it, depending on your role, you're probably there to support the child. You're probably not there to be their counselor or their therapist. And if that's the case, then just simply use reflecting to help them think about the answer for themselves. It's perfectly okay to say, I don't know. And of course, encourage them to talk to their caregiver about that. Oftentimes, if you have simpler questions, you could also say, let's go find that answer together. If for instance they want to know about a person that is dying, maybe in the hospital or the hospice house, and they want to know if mommy or daddy can eat or drink, I don't know, let's go find that answer together. Finding a way to include the child in the process so that it's a little bit less scary. All right, so we want to meet the child where they are. We don't want to force them to talk, and we want to be calm and ready for all reactions. And what I mean by that is you may have a child that cries profusely when you talk to them about death or dying, or you might have a child that has a ton of questions. You might have a child that wants to flee and run out of the room that you're in, so you need to be ready for everything. It's also helpful for you to have a little bit of backup. So we're gonna talk a little bit about prepping, and during that time you'll have an idea of who should be in the room with you when you're having these conversations. It's also really important to create a safe space when you're getting ready to have these conversations. You want the space to be open to questions, crying, all feelings, and that involves us not putting our judgment on the child, right? Sometimes kids have no questions, and we might be quick to think, oh my gosh, did they hear me? Do they not understand that I just told them this terrible bad news? Or perhaps they're crying profusely and you can't get a word in, or maybe there's no tears and you just see a flat affect and you're like, something is wrong. All of that is okay. Creating a safe space is important though, and we're going to talk about more about that in a little bit. And of course, tips for talking about death with children, using that scientific approach again. Phrasing the cause of death with a scientific approach really helps kids to have that concrete understanding. Hopefully you can hear my superhero music here. But let's get you ready to get your game face on, okay? Our role is to be a support, to be a superhero maybe for these kids as we share some of the most terrible news. So let's get ready for that. So get your game face on. All right, let's talk about breaking the taboo. Death is taboo, okay? I don't think there's anyone that can convince me otherwise. When I was teaching a course to college students on this, we talked about it so much, about how death is not readily talked about with their peers, with their families. I had them do an advanced directive for practice, and their families freaked out that they had to think and talk about that. But it was so much education for them to understand that death can happen at any time. Okay, and so it shouldn't be a taboo. The more we talk about it, the more we get comfortable with it, the easier it will be to understand and process. So the first line here, kids are too young to talk about death. I hear that all the time. People still believe that kids don't grieve. They also believe that, oh, he's too young, he shouldn't be a part of that. Or kids shouldn't belong at funerals, or kids don't belong in hospitals. I'm here to tell you that they do. And that's because all of that affects their grief journey. It affects their processing and their ability to heal. It affects their future in terms of trust and their ability to understand concepts about death and dying. So think about sympathy cards. Have you ever gone to the store and looked for a sympathy card? Next time you go, you should definitely do this. Try to find a sympathy card that actually has the word dead, died, or death in it. You can't do it. It doesn't exist. It is always filled with flowery language about your person is in a better place with God and the angels. And I know that they're looking down and smiling at you. Now, all of that may be true, okay? And I'm not here to tell you otherwise. What I'm here to say is someone died. And there's no flowery language that you can use in lieu of that. Someone died. And you know what? People try to convince me that it's too harsh to use that language. But you know what? It simply is not. By you not using that word, you are not fully acknowledging that this person died. And as we talked about a little bit ago, this very well could be the worst day of someone's life when that person died. And for us to rainbow and butterfly it up by using words like passed away or in a better place or with the angels and not truly acknowledging what happened, to me, that's like not acknowledging the pain that that person is feeling. It is not rainbows and butterflies. It is a death and it is life changing. And we need to acknowledge that. So avoidance is a big part of the taboo. I can bet you that many people that you work with, staff in the hospital or hospice or in your office, will avoid having that death conversation. Not everybody is comfortable with the death conversation. And that's part of the taboo, right? We're not used to saying it. We don't know the proper language to use. We don't feel confident. Even peer to peer. I was in a meeting this week where the hospital staff was telling us that they don't like hearing the words fetal demise, that they'd prefer we use language like angel babies. And I almost had my eyes fall out of my head. It was crazy. I'm not suggesting fetal demise is the right language to use, but angel babies are also not the right language to use. We have to get more comfortable with using words like dead and died. We have to get comfortable because it really helps people to understand that we understand the severity of this issue, the severity of the pain. This is not a small thing. This is a colossal, big, huge, super huge thing that happened, and we need to acknowledge it. So I put this quote here. Grief in its entirety is looked up as a taboo. In almost all cases, taboos are found to be false, and once we speak of these things, we are free. So think of it that way. As soon as you get through this PowerPoint and you hear my presentation, hopefully you'll feel a little bit more confident and a little bit more free to share this information with peers, families, and kids. Okay, so sharing the deaf news with children. Let's plan the conversation. What are the steps? Some steps here for you are this. Number one, create a safe environment, free from noise, commotion, and people. You are not going to have this conversation in the middle of the nurse's station or in the middle of the hallway. You might not even have this in the patient's room. You might need to find a safe, calm place for kids and families to gather where you're going to share this news. You're also going to want to encourage safe people to be present who are comforting to the child. Is that their caregiver, their sibling, their Grammy, their aunt, their uncle, whoever the child feels safe with, that's who you want there because you're going to need their backup. The child is going to probably need a hug from them at the end of this, and you're going to want them there. Step 3, you got to find that lovey. Find that stuffed animal, that blankie, whatever it is that provides that child with comfort, and have them bring it with them. Because I don't know about you, but when I'm crying, I might hug on my stuffed animal or my pillow because I need comfort, or I might go to my loved one for a hug. But if that's not available, their stuffy, their lovey is really going to provide some comfort, and they're going to need it. So then you're going to plan to share the news. And when we are planning to share the news, we are going to be very concrete about it. And I put some info in here about prepping to tell them that mommy is going to die or telling them that mommy has died. And I want to just pause and take a moment to remind you how important it is for us as clinicians, child life specialists, to share with caregivers the importance of telling kids the severity of an issue. If someone is going to die, the child needs to know. They just need to know. Why? Because they deserve to know, because their person is dying and they have no idea. I work with so many kids who had no idea their person was going to die, who simply believed they were going to get better, who believed if they would pray about it, they would get better, who believed if they would just behave, that person would be better. And then guess what? The person died. And the child now has all of this guilt because they believed if they would pray about it, or if God loved them enough that their person would be saved, or if they had good behavior, their person would be saved. And now the child has enormous guilt because they think they didn't do those things properly. And why do we want to put that on a child? It is our job to take that barrier and that weight off that child. We shouldn't give that to children. It shouldn't hurt to be a child, okay? And we need to help them as much as we can to prepare them to get ready for this terrible, no good, very bad day that's about to happen to them. So if you have the ability to advocate on behalf of children to help their caregiver to understand the importance of prepping children for what is to come, do it. I can't stress it enough. So I put on here what not to say, because again, I hear this so much. Mommy is going to be an angel and watch over you. What does that mean? Kids take it literally. Oh, my mommy's an angel. I can see her anytime I want. Or my mommy can see me anytime I want, even when I'm in the shower, even when I'm in the bathroom. This is just, it is too hard to explain this to kids because, again, they are concrete thinkers. They are thinking of this very logically and trying to make sense of it. So we do not want to flower it up and make it confusing. So notice the next sentence. Remember when we talked about mommy's organs shutting down? Last night, mommy's organs stopped working and she died. Notice the setup. If you shared with the child ahead of time, mommy is really getting sick. She is ill. Her organs are shutting down. When organs shut down completely, a person dies. You're prepping the child for that conversation that is to come. And it will go way better if you could have planted the seeds a week or so before to help him to get ready. So step 5, be present with the child for his or her response, both verbal and physical. Again, I can't sit here and tell you every response that's going to be given to you from a child after you share this news. You could have, okay, very matter-of-fact response. You could have a complete outburst. I had a child when I helped a caregiver tell information about a mom who had died to children. I had a child throw himself on the floor on his back and scoot around our entire hospice house and say, I'm trash, nobody loves me, I'm trash. And I promise you, I could have never prepared myself and the rest of the clinical team for that. It was traumatizing to see his reaction. And that was because he had also had his dad die about a year earlier. So now he had both parents die and he was feeling completely left. No one left there to take care of him. Everyone he loves leaves him. Okay, so you must be prepared for any possible reaction that could come. Try to have a room where you can close the door and maybe even have yourself between you and the child and the door. So that way you can catch them from running. You don't want to have sharp objects nearby. Of course, you want to create a safe environment for kids. Also, you want to bring some tools with you. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but don't go empty-handed to this meeting. Also, at the end, always ask the child if they have any questions. You might have to repeat this step a few times. Initially, after you share this news, you can ask that. And I bet you a child might not have any questions because they're still processing and trying to make sense of those words you just told them. But it is possible that they might have questions later. So you definitely want to follow up to find out. Okay, so let's touch base on actually having the question here. And I'm just going to go back to make sure. Notice here that I skipped one. So let's go back and just go over preparation, because preparation is really important. And so when you are planning to have the conversation, as we just went over, you want to do this preparation as well. You want to prepare yourself mentally, physically for the conversation. You want to make sure you're ready to share information with the child before you do it. Don't project your fears onto the child. They'll be able to tell if you're nervous or scared about having this conversation. You also want to prep with the caregiver and the family. Provide them with this education. Share the recommendations with them. We recommend doing this. We recommend having this conversation. We recommend telling the child now rather than later. You are the expert. The parent and the caregivers, they need to know that, and they need to trust you. So you want to educate them on the importance of being open and honest. And you also want to prep with them. Who is the one that's actually going to share the news? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be you? Are we going to do it together? Who's going to be present in the room? And then what do you want to happen next after we share the news? When I shared the news collectively with the family to these two children about their mom dying, the caregiver, the guardian, actually shared the news, but I was there to support and be present and answer questions and follow up the caregiver because he needed support too. So you might have that role as well. Always have resources for them to take home as well. Pamphlets, workbooks, storybooks, whatever that family needs to help. You also want to prep the clinical staff or your team. Let them know that this conversation is going to happen. Let them know the proper language they should be using when they're working with a family who has children. We don't want the nurse to come in after you and use the wrong language, because that will really confuse the child. Also, make sure they know that you are going to have this conversation with them and who is going to be present. Prepping the child for what is to come is probably the hardest part. And finding the perfect time. When is the perfect time? Do you do it before school, after school? Do they stay home from school that day? You just need to find the perfect environment at the perfect time, but you need to let the child know what is to come. Danielle, we're going to sit down. We have to have a conversation about mommy. Mommy's in the hospital and we need to talk about that. I mean, just a simple sentence like that will really help a child to know, oh, we have a serious conversation coming. And then prepping for a visit. Is this person still alive? And is the child going to visit them knowing this very well could be the last time they see this person alive? Or are they visiting the person dead? Is this the last time they're ever going to lay eyes on their person? And is it this their final opportunity to say goodbye? They might have questions. How will my person look? Can I touch them? Can I talk to them? Can they hear me? So you want to prep yourself to have all those answers. You can touch them. Yes, they can hear you. And we encourage you to talk to them and tell them whatever you need them to know. Hopefully that helps. Okay, we did talk about planning the conversation. So let's now talk about having the conversation. How do you share this news with kids? First, you got to explain what death is. And I like to start with everything that lives dies. You can introduce the concept of death by talking about a bug or an animal, because we know that children have heard this language before. It's important to remember that children and toddlers, preschoolers, the young ones, they are going to need this information repeated multiple times. That might not be your role. That might be the caregiver's role, but it is super important to prep the caregiver for that. We have a lot of families that we work with that the child, because of their developmental age and stage, they ask all the time, where's mommy, where's mommy, where's mommy, where's mommy? Not because they are developmentally delayed, but because they're at the right stage to not understand quite yet. Where did mommy go? They keep talking about mommy dying, and I understand dying, but I don't understand where mommy is, right? So they're going to ask this over and over. And it's important to understand and recognize that can be really tough on the caregiver. Imagine the caregiver having to repeat this over and over and over again. That, remember, mommy died, she's in heaven. Remember, mommy's organ shut down and she died. So just prep the caregiver for that. And of course, adolescents and teens may need more details or proof about what happened and who and how they're dying and why they're dying. Be honest and tell it straight. Age appropriately, of course. Presenting facts will keep their imagination from wandering with speculation. There are also long-term effects that lying or omitting the truth can have on a child. We know it creates a lack of trust, a misidentity, and an inability to grieve. So we want to avoid all of that. They have so much to handle already. Why create more problems for them? So be honest, but age appropriate. Where are they now? That question might come up. We don't want to use language like they're in a better place. It is not true. Children will be the first to tell you a better place would be here with me, not wherever you think they are. So instead of focusing on where the deceased person is now, try to help redirect the child to share a memory with you about that person. Oh, tell me a memory about mommy. What was your favorite thing to do with her? And get them to share about that. The stages of grief. I always get lots of questions about the stages of grief. People want to know what stage they're at and how long they're going to be there. So do these stages even apply, right? If you were to ask me my opinion, I'd say they're a little bit outdated. We know stages of grief are just there as a guideline. People may or may not experience all of the stages, but we also know that they won't experience them in a specific order. Same goes with kiddos. They might never have anger, and that's okay. They may never have bargaining, and that's okay as well. What we need to know is that people are allowed to grieve whatever way they need to. Of course, we want them to grieve safely and without too many negative coping skills that can harm them, of course. But we have to remember not to pigeonhole them into a stage of grief. And people might ask you about them. The caregivers might ask you about them. And the best way to explain it is we don't care about the stages of grief. We just care about what grief you're in. Your grief is valid, your grief is important, and you can grieve however you need to. If you can approach it that way with them, you'll get a lot farther. So I put up some do's and don'ts in here because I think they are really helpful for when working with grieving kids. So we do want to listen and accept and care for grieving children. We want to allow them to express their feelings whichever way they need to. That might very well be punching a pillow or kicking a table. And maybe we can find a way to creatively help them to express their anger. Perhaps you will need to bring the medical play or the books or the colored pencils and the markers and the construction paper and let them scribble or draw a picture. We need to be available to them. Reflect back what the child is doing or saying rather than asking a lot of questions. Questions can be distracting and they show that we have an agenda. When we're there to support a grieving child, we're not there with an agenda. We're simply there to support them and help them with what they need. Lower your expectations. Go into these conversations without any expectations. Plan to be a perfect mirror to that child, to share with them the news, and then be present. Accept them for where they are. You might not get the reaction you thought you were going to get, and you might have to educate the caregivers on that as well. But just accept them, offer the support, and encourage them to share memories with you. Some don'ts. These are always fun, but we don't want to just say nothing. A lot of people say, I don't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. No, we don't want to do that. That really isn't going to help the situation. We also don't want to use language like, it's okay, everything's going to be okay, because this can really minimize their experience or feelings. Also, we truly have no idea if everything's going to be okay. I work with families who come after they've had one death. A month could pass by and they've had 3 more deaths, a car accident, and they lost their home. Nothing in that month was okay. And I don't want to minimize their situation by telling them that it's going to be okay. You also don't want to start any phrases of comfort with at least. Oh, at least you got to spend the holidays with them before they died. At least you can have more children. At least you got to see daddy before he died. None of those are helpful. It's actually really quite hurtful and very insensitive to start conversations like that. So we try to avoid it as best we can. You don't want to encourage children to be strong and cover up their emotions. Children truly take this to heart. I have teens that I work with that their family members told them, be strong for mom. Don't let her see you cry. She needs you to be strong for her. And to this day, that child has still never cried because of that. And that really stunts the growth and the healing process for that child. So we want to avoid that at all costs. We also want to avoid telling little boys, you're the man of the house now. You don't want to let mommy see you cry. That is a lot of pressure to put on a little boy. And oftentimes we want the parent to be the parent and the child to be the child. When a child loses a guardian or a sibling, they often have to grow up pretty quick. Their life changes a lot. And we want to try to keep them in their child-like world for as much time as we can. We don't want them to be an adult quicker than they have to be. You also don't want to tell kids how they ought to feel. Oftentimes kids will say things like, I feel so guilty. I know this was my fault. And people are quick to answer and say, you shouldn't feel guilty. You know it's not your fault. But that's just not true. We have no idea if it was their fault. And you're also taking that feeling away from that child. You're not allowing them to feel what they need to feel and be where they need to be. And that is our job. We are there to support them and be with them right where they are. And we can't do that if we're telling them how they ought to feel. Instead, you might try, I can only begin to imagine how difficult this is. I am here for you. Let's talk about it. You also don't want to hand crying kids or adults a tissue. And this one always kind of blows people's mind, but I always try to explain it like this. When people are crying, especially adults, they're quick to apologize for crying. You know, you see them crying and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I'm crying. We want people to cry. That is a huge way that they express how they're feeling. And it's a huge way of getting out some of their emotions and processing. So crying is okay. It's good. But when you hand someone a tissue, you're basically telling them, stop crying. You're making me uncomfortable. Go ahead and wipe your tears. So we really want to avoid that. We want people to cry. And we as society, we have to get more comfortable with allowing people to cry in our presence or in front of us, because it is normal and acceptable to cry, especially after someone has died. And conversely, it's also okay if people don't cry. Everyone has a different grief reaction. All right, so let's talk about some follow-up. After you've had this really tough conversation with kids and families, you know, what can you do to follow up? What should your next steps be? So first, you want to have resources ready for the family. You want to have a grief counseling consult ready. You know, can you share that with the family? Do they want follow-up from a grief counselor? Do they want a grief support group? How about a workbook for the children, or a storybook or a pamphlet? Anything with education for the caregiver to follow up with. I know very well that these caregivers might just take this home and throw it in a drawer, but I also know that months later, when they finally find that pamphlet or that flyer, they're really happy they did, and they're able to connect with us. And that is what we want. You also want to offer bereavement support to the adults. Think about it, although much of our job to focus on the children, we do need to make sure the adult is supported as well, because if we're sending the child home with that adult, we need to know the child is going to be loved and supported and taken care of. And for that to happen, the adult needs to be loved and supported and taken care of. So let's make sure we're getting resources over to that adult as well. You also want to normalize common reactions, responses, and feelings to grief, dying, and death. When you share news like this with a child, there are going to be different reactions, and most of them are going to be very common. So for you to normalize that to the caregiver will really help. They don't want to think that their child is reacting abnormally. So if you can normalize this for them, that will really help. And lastly, check in on your clinical team and offer support. Check in on yourself. If this was hard for you to share with a family and you felt emotions, if it was close to home, maybe you had a similar death or a similar situation, seek supervision, seek support. Call me if you need to. I would love to be able to meet with you and talk with you, and so would your supervisor, because we are human. We do not live in a vacuum. We are allowed to have feelings and have grief reactions to the stories that we hear, just as your clinical team and your other colleagues are as well. So definitely circle back with them and check in on them and see what they need, or if they have any talking, debriefing they want to do about the situation. They might also like to know how it went. They might want to know how the child took it or how the caregiver handled it. So that would be really helpful as well. All right, so I put up here for you to close here just some of my favorite resources. First of all, the National Alliance for Grieving Children is a national organization that supports all grieving children organizations. Many grief centers like us, hospices, anyone that supports grieving kids can be a member. They have webinars and resources and forums that you can access that are really helpful. They've also published this book to the right here called When Someone Dies. It is an amazing workbook that really gives you an opportunity to work side by side with a child who's grieving or who's going through a death process. They're experiencing a death, for not their own death, but a parent, sibling, family member death. You can also send this book home with a child. I encourage parents to work on this book with their child all the time, because even for us at our grief center, we only get to see them twice a month. I send that book home with the caregiver and encourage them to do it with them so that they're getting a chance to process their grief when I'm not there, which is good. We also have the Dougy Center. The Dougy Center is the first children's grief center located in Portland, Oregon. They are the epitome of all grief centers. All of us, other centers, we train from the Dougy Center and the NAGC, but Dougy Center has a lot of resources on their website that you can access as well. I've also included some books here for you. The Invisible String is a really helpful book for kids to understand that they are always connected to their person, even though they can't see them. The I Miss You book is a really great book to introduce the concept of death to children for the first time. Letting Go is another workbook from Usborne Books that really has some great activities in it. Again, self-guided or with a caregiver, either way, there are some good activities. And lastly, for our teens, Weird is Normal When Teenagers Grieve is another book. Now, this is a story, and it is written by a teenager who has experienced the death of her father. And it's a very good book, and I encourage all of our teens to read it who are grieving, who want to just feel like they're not alone. All right, and right here I have for you all of some references and resources that I pulled from. I did include additional websites for you. So if you're looking for any kind of pamphlets or articles or just some information to share with families, click on these and check them over, and you might have some luck finding just what you need to share with your families. So I am all finished up with my PowerPoint today, and it was so good to spend some time with you all and get a chance to go over these things with you. Please reach out to me. You'll be able to see my contact information in the PowerPoint. If you have any questions or need resources or backup materials, please feel free to contact me, and I look forward to connecting with you, and I hope this was helpful to help you understand that death doesn't have to be a taboo. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.